And he called and he said, I need a new bag for my survival suit. Well, that's a pretty strange story. I mean, request, right? But I happened to have an extra one. So I said, yeah, sure. I have an extra bag. It's $12 and you're welcome to come get it. Well, before he got there, Kodiak Daily Mirror, our newspaper, arrived at my door and I was looking it over. The headline was about a boat that had sunk and the crew was rescued because they were wearing survival suits. And one of those survivors was the guy who had just called me wanting a new bag for his survival suit.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Gretchen Rowe for the Demi Learning Show, and I am so excited today to invite my friend Joy Ellen Ng to talk to you about her adventures in Alaska. I had the privilege of reading her book, and it was one of the most compelling reads I have had in years. And Joy and I met at a conference this spring, and I've been waiting all summer to have this conversation. With that, Joy, will you introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm delighted to be with all of you. It's been a few years since I've been a homeschool parent, but I know that many of you are in the throes of it, and I love homeschooling. I still love talking about homeschooling. I love being with homeschoolers. I love encouraging homeschoolers. I love learning all the new things there are available to homeschoolers. And so it's just a real pleasure to be with all of you today for sure. And Gretchen thought maybe I should explain my background. So this is actually the view that I see from my desk. We lived in Alaska for 25 years, but we are now in southern Puget Sound on Anderson Island. I am actually in the conference room at our church because the internet is more reliable here. But my husband took that picture yesterday as we watched some baby seals being born on the beach right in front of our house. So that was pretty cool.
I think it's pretty amazing. So that kind of sets a picture for what Joy's going to talk about just a little bit because I wanted her to talk about her experiences of being an author. I wanted to talk about her experiences of being in Alaska and about being in the foundation uh, of being a growing homeschool mom. And Joy tells me that now that she's not actively homeschooling her own children, her job is to encourage those of us who are continuing to homeschool along our own journey. So I think you'll find lots of things to relate to as we talk today. Joy, my first question to you is, can you tell us a little bit about your path to becoming an author? Because this was not your first book, and now I'm anxiously awaiting your other book to arrive. So tell me about how this happened for you. Notice I didn't say to you, I said for you.
I like to say that I am an unlikely military wife, an unlikely homeschooler, and definitely an unlikely author. But I have learned that what God gives me to do, He gives me the everything I need to do it. So we had been in Alaska for 25 years, thought we would never leave. We loved Alaska. We were Alaskans through and through. But my mother-in-law needed us, and she lived in Tacoma, Washington. So when our last daughter went off to college, my husband retired for the second time. He first retired from the Coast Guard and then from his second career. We decided that we were going to move down and spend time with my mother-in-law. So we moved to Anderson Island in Puget Sound, which you can see is very beautiful. I spent every other day with mom, just sharing life. But one day, my daughter, who was a student at George Fox University, called and she said, Mom, my writing professor is an author. Can you get one of her books and read it and tell me what you think of her? So I proposed to Jimmy's mother, my mother in law, who couldn't see well because she had macular degeneration. I said, how about I get one of Sarah's teacher's books and I'll read it out loud to you, and then we can tell Sarah what we think of her teacher. Well, a book that Melanie Dobson had recently released was Chateau of Secrets, and it was historical fiction set in France during World War II. Now, my mother in law was a World War II war bride. from France. So she was 16 when the Nazis invaded her hometown. She met her husband, my father-in-law, during the war. They were married right after the war, and then they went to Germany as part of the American occupation forces in Germany. That's what we knew. That's all we knew because she never talked about it. But I started reading this book to her, and as I read, I'd stop and say, "Mom, was it really like that?" And, "Mom, what were you doing when that happened?" And she started telling me her stories. The interesting thing is she wouldn't be recorded, and if anyone else walked into the room, even if my husband walked into the room, she stopped talking. So somehow she trusted me with those stories. One story led to another. I would take notes and go home and write up what she had told me. And then the next time I went back, I'd read it to her and is this right? And she would make corrections and more stories would happen. And we spent 2.5 years sharing stories like that. I cannot tell you the incredibly close relationship we developed in the process of sharing those stories. And in many ways, I validated her life. I said to mom, "So, mom, your story needs to be told. Can I write a book about you?" And she said, "Well, you can't publish it until I'm dead, and then you can make your millions." So you can see she was a character, right? But these stories were amazing. It was life under the occupation, and it was awful. And then it was just such a sweet love story of how they met in her uncle's little butcher shop in France, and how she left everything she knew to go off with a man whose language she did not even speak, believe it or not, and made a new life in Germany. Amazing, amazing story. Well, I didn't really know how to write a book. I had all those notes that I had taken and rudimentary stories that I had written, but I have a dear friend named Leslie Leyland Field. Maybe you heard about her. She's quite a famous author at and she was in the process of writing a book called Your Story Matters. And she had a retreat in Atlanta, Georgia, and where she was inviting some people that she handpicked us and she wanted to go through all the premises she was teaching in her book and see how it played out with real people. Well, I went for 4 days, and she taught me how to write a book. She taught me how to set the scene and make the conversation and put it together in a compelling way. Anyway, it's called Quiet Courage, and that title came because one day we were talking and she said, "I wonder how I had the courage to marry dad and leave France." And I thought, "Okay, that's the title. We're gonna talk about your quiet courage to do that." So then I wrote the book, had a wonderful time doing it. Oh, Jimmy took me back to France. I researched dad's, he was already gone, but I researched all his military records. We went to France and Germany, visited all the places that they went. So I really got to see the places where it all happened. Then when I was done, Leslie was very proud of me. And she said, "Now you have to tell your story." And I said, "I don't have a story." And she said, "Of course you do." Well, I was too busy living my story to recognize that it was a story. And so I did. And I discovered that I do have a story. And this is one thing I learned. Everybody has a story, and I encourage everybody to find and tell your story. But Corey Ten Boom said that our lives are like a tapestry, and God sees the beautiful picture on top. And what do we see? We see the hanging threads, the cross stitches, the knots. It's a mess, right? But I learned that when I stepped back and looked back at my life, I got a glimpse of that beautiful picture that God was making. I got to see, oh, that's what he was preparing us for, or that's how he used that hard thing for good. And though it will be heaven before I get to see the whole picture, I have much more appreciation of what God is doing in our lives and much more. I am just so, I just understand his faithfulness so much better. And I know that he's been faithful in the past. He'll continue to be faithful in the future. So that's how I became an author.
Well, I think you're, what I loved about the way you wrote is that I felt like I was sitting at a table with you having coffee and you were telling me the story. And that's a talent that is rare, and, I did get a little fussed at one night. Dinner didn't happen here at the house because I was sitting on my back porch and the weather was glorious. I was too busy reading to realize, "Oh, uh, how about peanut butter jelly, guys?" Because I was too busy reading, and my youngest son, who just turned 20 a week ago, said, "Wow, you haven't done that in years." He said, "What book are you reading?" So and it was yours, of course. So,
Well, I'm so
Joy,
glad you enjoyed it.
so tell me what it was like to be a homeschool mom, because we we have so many families that we know who are military families. So not only do you have the, I don't want to say added pressure, it's just a different life. You've got all the things that you have to do militarily, but then you've got the compelling service to something higher, not only your faith service, but the military service. And often you get to homeschool kind of by yourself when your husband is off serving on the mission. So, how was that to be a mom homeschooling her children who often found herself by herself?
As I said, I was an unlikely homeschooler. Back in 1985, homeschooling was not in vogue. There was not a lot of support for homeschool moms. In fact, it was illegal in some places. And even in our social circles and in my family, people thought it was akin to child abuse. So it was just not something we thought about. And we were in Kodiak for 8 years, the 8 years that I wrote even there. And we had a sweet Christian school there. Loved it, and that's where our kids went, and never crossed my mind that I would ever homeschool my children. Well, then we got orders to leave Kodiak to go to Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and, we were to leave the end of August. We planned a big trip in between. We were gonna arrive in Cape Cod in October, not even knowing what town we were gonna live in, and where our kids were gonna go to school. So, what were we gonna do to for our children's education? So my husband said, "You're gonna have to homeschool the kids." And I said, "How can I do that?" And he said to me very profoundly, "How much damage can you do in a year?" I go, I guess, really, how much damage can I do in a year?" So with the bar set very, very low, we began our homeschool journey and never looked back, really. So that's how
So
we got started.
how old were the girls when you started then?
1st grade and 4th grade.
Wow. That's
Yeah,
a profound question that Jimmy asked you, though.
right?
Yeah.
Right? And, so I just didn't have great expectations of things that were gonna happen. I love my children. I loved reading to them. I loved learning with them, and it turned out to be absolutely wonderful. One thing we did, we traveled a long time, like 40 days from the time we left Kodiak till the time we,
Wait,
arrived
you
in Cape Cod.
drove from Kodiak to Cape Cod?
Okay, so we sold everything we owned except for what we had shipped. We flew to Anchorage, Alaska. We went to the Space A desk at Elmendorf Air Force Base, and we said, "What planes do you have going anywhere?" And they said, "Oh, we have one going to Japan in 3 hours." And we said, "Okay, we're going to Japan." So we got on that. We went spent a week in Japan, and then we flew to the Philippines. They had military air command, airlift command flights that went to the Philippines at that time too. So we went there, and then we got a flight back to the United States into California, and we drove. We rented a car, drove up to Jimmy's parents in Tacoma, bought a car, and drove across the country. So it was a huge trip. But, one of the gals asked a question about, um, what they can do to, enhance their RV trip in Alaska, and I'm just gonna tell you one thing I did on that long trip as a homeschool mom that was phenomenal. I had the girls make scrapbooks of the entire trip. They had to include every country and every state that we visited. And because of that, it made us notice all the details. What kind of money do they use? What kind of language do they speak? What are the crops here? What do people do for a living? We took pictures, we collected postcards, we kept ticket stubs and all those. We even pressed flowers, and all those things went into that scrapbook. And the kids, they mostly enjoyed it, though they were very unhappy with me when we drove across Rhode Island in 30 minutes and I made them include Rhode Island in their scrapbook. They said, "But we were hardly there."
You were born to be a homeschool mom,
Yeah,
you just didn't know that at the
yeah.
time,
Well,
so
those scrapbooks became prized possessions for sure. Then we arrived in Massachusetts, and I'm going to tell you that in 1985, homeschooling was illegal in Massachusetts. But we were Alaska residents. I hung my hat on that, and I kept going with the program we were using. And I didn't tell anybody, but it didn't take long for a truant officer to knock on my door. And I'll tell you, God was good. It was not always like this, but when he knocked on the door, my house was immaculate. My children were sitting at their desks doing their schoolwork. I had all the visual aids for the day laid out on the table. And he told me who he was. And with my heart beating wildly, I said to him, "Thank you so much for your interest in my children. Won't you come in and see what we're doing?" When I really wanted to slam the door in his face, but I know that God made me do that. And he came in, I showed him our curriculum, he could see what the kids were doing, and he said, "Well, I'm very impressed, but the superintendent is not going to like it." Well, a week later, we got a letter from the superintendent giving us permission to continue homeschooling our kids that year. How cool is that? What if I had
wow.
what if I had slammed the door in his face, you know?
Right, right.
So I
You
know
don't
that was
have
a
to
God thing.
attend every fight you're invited to,
Yeah.
right?
But then I'll tell you that as a military family, I mean, then we went to Puerto Rico and everywhere we went, we never had to worry about school anymore because we took school with us. We could travel when my husband traveled. We knew what we were going to do when we got there. It was very less stressful for the children, and we didn't always homeschool. We were always open to what God has for a particular child at that particular time. If there was a really good Christian homeschool, I mean, a Christian school, we took advantage of
Sure.
it. And we did actually put each of our children in a public high school for 2 years before they left home because we wanted to set them out slowly. We didn't want them to just go off having never experienced the world. So we did that.
I love the fact that you said that you would do for each child what was best for them, and, that was my husband's and my philosophy, and so we've done a little bit of everything from private school to public school to parochial school to homeschool to charter school. We did it all, and my kids were all successful. And I think it's good to be able to look back on that because you didn't close the door to opportunity. And Joy, you just said something about inviting that truant officer into your home. There's a lot of those kind of stories in your book where my first reaction would be, "Oh, no, we're not going to do that." And you did it anyway. Starting a business in your home. Tell me a little bit about that because that was I was so proud of you when you talked about starting that business, but you didn't even know all the areas that you were going to be able to serve when you started that business. So tell me a little bit about that.
So this is how the business started. So my husband was a search and rescue pilot in Alaska. And, oh, they were terrible accidents. The weather is very extreme in Alaska. Storms come out of nowhere. The water is so cold. People die of hypothermia after just minutes in the water. And Jimmy would come home after search and rescue cases, and he would say, "Oh, if only they had had a marine radio and would have called for help. If only they had been wearing a survival suit. If only they had had whatever, a life raft, they would have been we'd have been able to find them alive." And, he was especially concerned about our Coast Guard friends who had small boats, who had nothing except a life jacket on their boats. And, he suggested that maybe we could find a way to make safety equipment more affordable in Kodiak. In Kodiak, everything was very expensive. So, we started and he helped me a lot. He helped me a lot with researching the products and stuff, but I got a business license and I started at first just with special order stuff for marine radios and survival suits um and life rafts, and we marked them. At first, I just sold them at cost because I just wanted people to have them, and the benefit for
Mhm.
us was that
Sure,
I could get them at cost as well. So we immediately started getting better gear on our boats. That soon became unsustainable because there were other costs besides just the cost of
sure.
this stuff, and sometimes the shipping was more, and yada yada. Anyway, so we started, marking things up, just 10%. So I was not gonna get rich on this business. I did not wanna get rich on this business. I just wanted people to have the gear. Some of my favorite stories are, young guys, college kids would come up to fish on a fishing boat. Numerous times, I had them come to me and say, "I don't have money to buy a survival suit." They cost hundreds of dollars, like, and a lot
Mm,
of money, right?
sure.
Even at my discounted price. And they would ask, "Can I have the survival suit and I'll pay you at the end of the season?" I never said no, and I never got stiffed. Always, I had people come back and pay me. And so one of my this is a great story. A guy called me and he said he had purchased actually a survival suit from me, and he called and he said, "I need a new bag for my survival suit." Well, that's a pretty strange story. I mean, request, right? But I happened to have an extra one, so I said, "Yeah, sure. I have an extra bag. It's $12 and you're welcome to come get it." Well, before he got there, Kodiak Daily Mirror, our newspaper, arrived at my door and I was looking it over. It's very short. It doesn't take long to read it cover to cover, but the headline was about a boat that had sunk and the crew was rescued because they were wearing survival suits, and one of those survivors was the guy who had just called me wanting a new bag for his survival suit. How cool is that? When he got to my
Wow.
door, I handed him that bag and I said, "Oh, yeah, this is a gift. You are welcome to this, and I'm so thankful that you're alive."
Wow.
Yeah,
And, here you were in a place where I mean, you did not grow up there. You grew up on the East Coast, but you stepped into that environment, you saw a need, and you were still willing to go, "Well, I can figure this out."
yeah.
And I love that spirit.
Yeah, and it was hard to get fishermen at that time to buy survival suits. Many of them were really macho, didn't think that they needed it. It was an expense they didn't want to make.
Sure.
I literally walked the docks talking to guys on boats, trying to get them to buy them. We were most successful, however, my husband suggested this, when he talked to the Fishermen's Wives Club.
Of
and
course you
and
were.
yeah, and those women went home and made their husbands buy survival suits.
I bet they did. I bet they did. And, you were a wife whose husband was out in extreme environments doing remarkable things. So you had a background that could relate to them so thoroughly. And that's
Yeah.
pretty impressive as well. So tell me about halibut fishing because I was so impressed that you were willing to go, yeah, I can figure this out too.
So that was a dream of my husband's, not a dream of mine. But you know what? I love supporting my husband. We love doing things together. And so God provided us with a boat in kind of a miraculous way. And there we were with a 24-foot cabin cruiser and some gear. And we went halibut fishing. And in those days, there there were only certain days that you could fish for halibut. So it's different now. Now there are people have quotas and they can fish anytime during the summer until they meet their quotas. In those days, there was a big quota and anybody could fish. And when the quota was met, you were done fishing. So it would be said they'd start out with 6 days fishing, maybe, and then they'd tally up the number of fish that were caught. And then they'd say, okay, we can have another opening for 3 days and then maybe one more day. And if the weather was bad, you had to fish because that was the only opportunity you were gonna have.
Sure.
So it wasn't always flat, calm, and sunny when we were fishing, and sometimes that was pretty scary. I like to say that we have some of our very best memories commercial fishing and some of our very worst. But it was exciting. It was very exciting.
So look at all the things that you all accomplished because I mean, Jimmy was working more than full time as a pilot, and that was, I would say, you were his first love, but that was his first love other than you. Um, and then you started a business, and then you had children. Joy, you had a lot of irons in the fire. So, how did Joy keep her joy with all the things that you had going on?
There's an underlying thing that was the hardest part for me, and that was the fear, and I talk about that quite a bit in the book because, fear was a problem for me. I had faith. I was saved as a child, and I knew that God loved me, that he had a plan for my life, and, I knew that he loved my husband and my children. When we first went to Alaska, I would like to say fat, dumb, and happy. I was idealistic and oblivious to the dangers in Alaska. The first summer we fished, even when it got wavy out there, never dawned on me that what we were doing was dangerous. It was all good. But we had been in Alaska for about 6 months. It was, the end of October. Jimmy had the duty. That meant he was hanging around the air station waiting, for a call. And, one of our friends, another pilot's wife, knocked on my door. She was looking for Jimmy, and she said her husband, another pilot that we knew well, had gone fishing. They each had a 5-year-old son, and they had taken the boys with them, and she said, "I expected them home by now, but they haven't come. It's getting dark, and the weather has turned." She said, "I'm worried." And I said, "Well, don't worry. Jimmy has the duty. He knows where they fish." It was quite a ways away. I mean, it was a 7-mile drive across a mountain pass and then another 10 miles to the
Mhm.
area where they like to fish. So some open ocean in between. But
I
we
should
often
also say, I should interrupt you and say a 7-mile drive that isn't like 7 miles on an East Coast domestic road
no,
either,
it
so
was a dirt road over a mountain pass. Yeah, with switchbacks. So, but then there was a bay that was open to the ocean where the water got very rough, and then there are little islands with tall mountains and big trees on them that they fished in between in the straits there. And we had run into those guys fishing over there often, so Jimmy knew where they fish. So I said, "Don't worry, Jimmy knows where they fish. He'll go get them." Well, Jimmy took off that night in that helicopter and through that mountain pass, and I tell about it in detail in the book, but the bottom line is it was a very difficult search in very rough weather, and, their 18-foot Boston whaler had flipped end over end when they tried to anchor that boat in strong current. They were able to get one of the boys out from under the boat. They were not able to get Jake out. And by the time my husband found them, because of the miracle of a tiny spark, it's actually amazing that they were able to find them in all those white caps and almost crashed in the trees of the tall island nearby. Anyway, they were able to bring home those two dads and one of the boys, but Jake died. And we gathered in the little, oh, see, I'm going to cry even now thinking about it. We gathered in that little chapel in Kodiak and we all cried together. And we were thankful for the safety of the other three. But I knew that they had just gone out fishing like we did. And a terrible accident had happened, and the weather got bad. And my husband almost lost his life in the crash. And suddenly I knew fear. And, my fear was not unfounded. I mean, a few years later, Jimmy found his best friend on the beach after his helicopter had crashed during a failed rescue attempt. So God didn't always answer my prayers the way I wanted them to. There were many successful rescues, many of them, and Jimmy is one of the most decorated Coast Guard pilots. He has 2 distinguished flying crosses among many other but those are because he did some really dangerous things, and God gave him a lot of successes, but not always. So, I struggled with fear. I learned that fear is inevitable, that faith is a choice.
yeah, I think that's very good wisdom to impart, and I will tell you those stories were compelling. I felt like I was there with them the way that you told them.
When Jimmy first started flying, we chose Psalm 139, 9 and 10 as our very own verse. It says, "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the remotest parts of the sea. Even there, your hand will guide me and your right hand will hold me fast. And at first, those promises were very easy to believe. But after I learned about the dangers and I became afraid, it was a little more difficult. And I would just call out. I knew Jimmy was out flying. I would call out to God. I would try to picture that helicopter in the palm of God's hand. And I would have peace until the next time I would panic.
Sure, and as long as he was a pilot, I mean, it's not like it went away for you because every case, that's what you call them, every case he went out on could turn into something wild very
Right.
easily.
Right. And I didn't always know whether that he was on a case. He would go to work and he wouldn't come home for dinner. And I'd call the operations center and I'd wait till he should long since have been home from work. And I'd say, "So, is Jimmy coming home for dinner tonight?" And they'd say, "Oh, no, he's out the chain, probably not today." And it might be a week till I'd see me. I mean, these were really long distances that he was flying.
In these last 5 minutes, what words of encouragement would you have for folks who are going to listen to our conversation together? Just tell them what you would like them to know.
So, the most important thing is to just give your life to Jesus Christ. He's got an amazing, amazing plan for you. And it's not going to be anything like what you think it's going to be. He's going to surprise you all along the way, but don't let that throw you because what he gives you to do, he'll equip you to do. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Joy, in these closing minutes, let's talk one more time about your 2 books. The book about your mother-in-law is called,
Quiet
um,
courage.
Quiet Courage, and then this book that I read is called Even There, and, I both of them were really compelling. Where would people go to find your books?
They're on Amazon.
Yep,
Yeah, you could
exactly.
just
Well,
order them on Amazon. And
I
I
will say that in the show notes, I will include links to both books
Okay, thank you, I
because,
appreciate that,
I
and I
think
like to
that
tell
that would be
people, if
wonderful.
you like my book, leave a leave a, yeah, leave
A
a good
review.
review. If you
Sure,
don't like
absolutely.
it, don't bother with the review.
Of course not, of course not. Joy, this has been such a great pleasure having the opportunity to talk to you, and, was there a question I should have asked that I did not?
So I wanted to just address one of the listeners asked about that trip to Alaska that she's gonna take in the RV,
Yes.
and I did wanna mention the scrapbook idea because that's really fun, but I also wanna be sure that she knows that she needs to order the Milepost 2025 edition, or if she goes next year, the whatever is the most recent edition. That book tells you everything that there is on the whole road system in Alaska. And, it's invaluable, and I know that it's available digitally, but I think only if you buy the book itself, but you don't wanna miss that book, it's really helpful, and then take time to stop along the way. Stop at all the visitor centers and the wildlife centers, and go for hikes, and eat where the locals eat and talk to people. Alaskans love Alaska, so be sure
They
that you
do
meet
indeed.
people and talk to them. Just take it all in.
They
Oh,
do
yeah. My
indeed.
husband says, "Don't feed the bears."
Oh, yes, this is also very true. Don't feed the bears. Joy, I wanna say thank you, and I wanna say thank you to Jimmy for being your technology behind the scenes today. I really appreciate his helping you make this happen, and this has been a very great pleasure for me. I've looked forward to this all summer, and thank you all so much for being, part of this journey, and thank you to everyone who joined us today for allowing us to come into your living rooms and allowing me to share this very special friendship that God allowed me to create by meeting Joy this spring in Anchorage. Joy,
Well,
thank you so much.
thank you for having me, and I wanna say, anybody out there, I encourage you to find and tell your own story, and if you do, let me know because I'd love to read it.
Absolutely. We will do that indeed. Joy, thank you so much for this time. I am grateful. And you know what? It's funny that you should say that because a couple of years ago, I had the pleasure of inviting a dear friend um, onto the show to talk about writing your own story. So I will include that webinar in the show notes for everyone. So,
Oh,
Joy,
sounds
thanks so
good.
much for everything. I do have one question here. This is from Laurette. She says, "Thank you. I love this video. Joy is such a great and loving person. She's family oriented, loving, giving, kind, smart, and so much more." And then she says, "Hi, Jibby." And I know you to be all those things because meeting you in Alaska was one of the greatest treasures I had this spring. So thanks, Joy, for everything. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And we'll look forward to coming into your living rooms again soon. God bless you all.
Thank you.
Thanks again for joining us. We're glad to be a part of your educational community. You can help us grow our community even more by rating, reviewing, and subscribing to the show wherever you may be hearing this. Don't forget that you can access the show notes and watch a recording at demilearning.com/show or on our YouTube channel. We'll see you again next time. Until then, keep building strong foundations for lifelong learning.